channel. Today's video is unlike any video I've covered up until now. Every murder I've shown you guys has been relatively quick and yes, painful, but this one in particular is the worst case I will cover in this series and by far the worst I've ever researched. This murder is one of the worst known by true crime enthusiasts and definitely the worst single victim crime in Japanese history. Today's video covers a journey to hell on earth endured by one teenage girl in the late 1980s, and I'll be explaining it in detail. With that, I'd like to say viewer discretion is heavily advised because I'll be discussing topics such as the R word, sexual assault, torture, murder, general disregard for human life. This case is known internationally as High School Girl Wrapped in Concrete. If you're squeamish or sensitive to any of the details I previously mentioned, I highly advise skipping ahead to the arrests, sentencing, or just clicking off the video entirely. You've been warned, let's get into this. For a little bit of context, let me introduce the victim in today's case, Junko Furuta. Junko was born on January 18, 1971 in Misato City, Japan. Misato City is located in the Saitama Prefecture of Japan and is approximately 36 kilometers or 22 miles northeast of Tokyo, the capital city. Junko was born into a relatively happy family to her mother, father, and two brothers. Junko went to high school at Yashio Minami High School and was a senior at the time. Junko was a very popular girl among students, staff, and family, had solid grades and a near-perfect attendance record, truly excelling academically. Junko was also friendly towards everyone she met between school, home, and work. She didn't have a mean bone in her body. Junko had a part-time job at a local plastic molding facility, but was planning to leave for an electronics store. She was preparing to be a salesperson and was saving for a post-graduation vacation with her friends. Her friends said she dreamed of becoming an idol singer. Junko was liked by everyone she knew, truly radiating positivity. On Friday, November 25th, 1988, Junko was returning home from her part-time job to watch the final episode of a show she liked, Tonbo, or Dragonfly in English, with her mother. Unfortunately, Junko never made it home. In fact, she worked her final shift and attended her final day of school that day. While riding her bike home, Junko was shoved off her bike by a boy who disappeared. She caught a glimpse of his face so she could confront him if she saw him again. As she was brushing herself off, another boy approached her. This boy's name was Hiroshi Miyano. Miyano asked Junko if she'd like him to walk her home, thinking it'd be better than getting shoved off her bike again. She accepted, and the pair began walking. At some point during this walk, Miyano leaned close to Junko and told her that he was a member of the Yakuza, and threatened to kill her if she screamed, made a noise, or tried to escape. To those who might not know what the Yakuza is, it's an organized crime group in Japan similar to the Gambino family in the US back when the Mafia was a major influence in American crime. After a little more walking, Miyano led Junko to an abandoned warehouse and forced himself on her. Around 9 p.m., Miyano brought Junko to a nearby hotel and did it again. After these heinous actions, Miyano called 3 of his friends to gloat about what he'd done and invited them to a park to meet Junko. Around 1 a.m., Miyano brought Junko to the park where his friends were waiting, and as soon as she arrived, she knew it was a setup. Junko immediately recognized one of the boys, Nobuharu Minato, the boy that pushed her off the bike. The other 2 boys, Joe Ogura and Yasushi Watanabe, are meeting Junko for the first time. At the park, Miyano ordered the 3 boys to go through Junko's backpack, where they found a notebook containing her home address in it. Miyano realized he could now do anything he wanted without any repercussions. Miyano threatened to send more Yakuza members to Junko's house to hurt or even kill her family if she didn't follow his orders. During the meeting, Ogura suggested holding Junko captive at one of the boys' houses. Miyano liked the suggestion a lot, and the boys decided to keep Junko at Minato's house. Minato's house was a common place for the boys, that they would all hang out. Both Miyano and Ogura were lowly Yakuza rats at the time of the crime, often abusing their association with the organization to rape and rob young women with Minato and Watanabe. Minato and Watanabe weren't involved directly with the Yakuza, but they did have connections and would often hang out with Miyano and Ogura. In the summer of 1988, all 4 boys dropped out of high school to take part in petty crimes and gang rapes in the Saitama Prefecture. Their attendance records and grades were dropping from spring to summer of 1988, so they decided to stop showing up entirely and live lives of crime. I'd like to clear up a couple of common misconceptions I found in videos surrounding this case online. Firstly, Miyano never asked Junko out, and Junko never rejected him. At the time of her abduction, Junko never even knew any of the criminals. Like I said, all 4 boys dropped out of high school in 1988, but the boys also attended a different high school than Junko at the time. Knowing this, Miyano never asked Junko out. Rather, he planned the crime as he observed her going home while he was working at a flower shop. Another misconception is that Junko was single at the time of her abduction, which led to the last misconception. Junko had a boyfriend at the time of her abduction, who I'll discuss later on in the video. With that out of the way, let me continue on with the terrible circumstances of this case. Upon arriving at Minato's house in Adachi, the boys took Junko upstairs to Minato's room and immediately started taking turns with her. Miyano then lit a match and burned Junko's private area and ankles. As the match continued to burn, it frightened her and caused more burns in the affected areas. The boys then locked Junko on the balcony in minimal clothing to sleep alone. This is just the tip of the iceberg. About 2 days after Junko's abduction, her family filed a missing persons report in fear that she had been kidnapped, which she was. Hearing of this news, Miyano became afraid of police interest and interference, so he forced Junko to call her parents and tell them she ran away, was safe, and staying at a friend's house for a while. None of this was true in the slightest. Junko's parents didn't buy it at first, and after a couple of hours of talking to them, they eventually believed her and called off the missing persons report. Naturally, though, her parents still had a level of concern because running away was not in Junko's character. She had a pretty healthy family life, so why would she run away? Now that the missing person report was cleared up, Miyano continued his horrific actions against Junko. Minato's family genuinely thought Junko was their son's girlfriend for a little while, so they tried to keep out of it for the first week or two. During her time in captivity, reports suggest that Junko was raped upwards of 400 times by approximately 100 men. Most of it was done by the main 4 perps, but regardless, that's a terrifying piece of the story that 100 men got illegally physical with her. As days turned to weeks, Junko's health was declining. The 4 boys would barely give her any food, usually just giving her scraps and having her drink milk, water, and alcohol. Not long later, though, they stopped giving her any real food and forced her to eat cockroaches, drink her own urine and theirs, and sometimes even consume her own feces. They gave up on giving her sufficient amounts of water, too, so she pretty much was just drinking milk and alcohol and being forced to huff paint thinner and smoke multiple cigarettes at once. Before they stopped giving her food, she was occasionally brought to eat meals with Minato's family. In one instance, she was brought to eat with all 4 boys and another woman along with the family. Minato's family made a comment that Junko didn't really eat or say much, and once the boys left with the other woman, Minato's family urged Junko to leave, even helping her do so. She didn't manage to make it far, unfortunately. When Minato returned, he heard the news of Junko escaping, so he left the house again, caught her, and brought her back to Minato's house. His family warned him against his actions as he dragged Junko back into his room. This clears up another misconception. A lot of stories and videos suggest that Minato's family did squat to help Junko escape, but they got her to escape. The bad thing is, Minato then found her and forced her back into the house. His family did do something about it and warned him about continuing the abuse, but didn't do any further in this instance out of fear of Minato hurting them in retaliation. When Minato got back to his room, he punished Junko by severely beating her. He then called the other boys back to his house, to which they all hurried over and beat Junko as well. These beatings were a regular part of Junko's captivity at Minato's house. Among all of the ways to torture this poor girl, the 4 boys would regularly beat her with iron bars, bamboo sticks, drop 20-plus pound dumbbells on her body, and even use their kicks and punches as weapons. These dumbbells would be dropped all over Junko's body except her head, and the force was so great that it would shatter tiny bones in her hands and feet, leave severe bruises on her arms, legs, and torso, and severely damage her digestive tract. Junko's bowels were so damaged after these dumbbells being dropped on her that she'd lose control of herself involuntarily. When that would happen, it would result in further, more harsh beatings. Another method of beating the boys would take part in was pinning Junko's body down, standing on her arms, legs, and torso, and even stomping her face into the ground. This shattered her nose and filled her sinuses with blood, and the facial swelling was so bad she could only breathe from her mouth for much of her time as a hostage. When she wasn't being beaten, she was oftentimes sleeping alone in the overnight winter temperatures and barely any clothing. When she wasn't outside, the boys would bring her in and force her to be nearly or completely naked in front of them. This was humiliating enough, but the boys would also force her to sing in front of them, sing while they beat her, and that's just among other horrible things that they did to her, all while laughing at her. This humiliation and embarrassment was constant throughout. Around the 16th day she was held at Minato's house, one of the dozens of men who had raped Junko until this point told his brother about the situation and what was going on at the Minato household. The dude's brother told their parents, who relayed the information to the authorities. The local police in Adachi sent 2 deputies to the Minato household while both Minato's parents and Junko were present. Nobuharu Minato, the pathetic excuse of a boy, was not present. The deputies asked Minato's parents if they had any information of a schoolgirl being in their house, and out of fear of being assaulted by their son, they said they had no knowledge of a girl being at their house. Minato's parents gave deputies full permission to enter the house, giving them a reason to come in and giving them a reason not to be beaten by their son, but the officers declined the parents' offer. They stated they, quote, had no reasonable suspicion to search the house, left the house, and went back to the police station. Junko was not found by the officers who could have saved her life. After the story made headlines across Japan, the officers, whose names are still undisclosed at the time of this recording, were rightfully slammed for not searching the house. As time progressed, Junko endured new forms of physical torture. Junko's captors would hold Junko's body up and use her as a human punching bag. This, paired with the dumbbells, severely damaged her urinary system, leading to the incontinence of both bathroom functions. This type of beating also led to the first of 2 times Junko suffered convulsions. One of the most painful types of torture Junko endured was when Miyano would set her on fire. He didn't stop at one time, he set her on fire multiple times. Albeit this wasn't the most common type of torture, it was definitely one of the boys' favorite types of torture. Most of the time this happened, Miyano would drench Junko's legs in lighter fluid and then would light a match. Other times, though less common, they'd set Junko's torso and arms on fire. Occasionally, the fires would spread to her head. These fires would cause 2nd and 3rd degree burns, which often became infected due to zero medical attention. The boys would further burn Junko in a different way, a way that hurt me just reading about it. When Junko would flinch at the boys' attempts to hit her or beat her, they would hold her down and drip burning hot candle wax onto her eyelids. Truly despicable what they did to her. One day, the boys weren't paying attention, and Junko managed to crawl out of Minato's room into the general living area. She couldn't use her legs because of the continuous beatings and fires, but she reached the Minato family telephone and dialed 110. It's the emergency line for the police in Japan. An operator answered the phone, but before Junko could say anything, Hiroshi Miyano caught her and took the phone from her hand. He heard the operator and said, quote, "Sorry, I accidentally called," before hanging up. Miyano dragged Junko up the stairs and cruelly beat her for trying to escape genuine torture. This part of the video is one of, if not the most sensitive and graphic part of the entire case, so if you're sensitive to topics like sexual assault and torture, I advise skipping ahead a few minutes. To everyone else, you've been warned, so let's talk about the darkest part of the story. During Junko's captivity, when she wasn't being beaten, lit on fire, or raped, the boys would sexually torture her. How so, you might ask? Well, the boys would regularly insert objects into Junko. These objects include scissors, jagged or broken items, glass bottles, chicken skewers, bamboo, cigarettes both lit and burnt out, various kinds of vegetables, and firecrackers. I'll start with cigarettes. The boys were all smokers, and when they finished their cigarettes, they'd put them out on Junko and then stuff them inside of her. This effectively made Junko their human ashtray. Other times they would put Coca-Cola bottles, which in the 1980s were made of glass, inside Junko, which would severely damage areas of Junko especially when they chatter inside of her. Firecrackers would also be inserted into Junko's private areas as well as her mouth and ears. Junko's eardrums were damaged from these firecrackers, and on one occasion, the boys put a lit light bulb inside of Junko's, and when it wouldn't fit, they rubbed it until it shattered. A lit light bulb is extremely hot, and the pain from the heat combined with the pain from shattered glass had to have been one of the worst pains she felt in her short life. In December of 1988, the boys left Junko alone one day to gang rape a 19-year-old woman. This woman's name is unknown at the time of the recording, but keep her in mind as the story progresses. 1989 begins. Junko spent Christmas alone, which in Japan isn't necessarily spent with families giving gifts to one another, but rather couples sharing the night together. Junko also spent the New Year celebration alone. Her beatings became less frequent, but when they happened, they were severe. At this point, she'd been raped approximately 400 times, but not in a long time. Her captors found her boring and ugly, just keeping her around to take their frustrations out on. Her burns were infected and emitting an odor similar to that of a rotting body. Her captors are the sole reason she's become what she has to this point. She hadn't been fed in weeks, and at this point really only drank milk, barely even any water. Any amount of food would immediately make Junko throw up, and she couldn't control her urinary system or bowels. One time, Junko took over an hour to crawl to a nearby restroom as her captors stood by laughing at her. Junko suffered another pair of terrible injuries. I'll put them on screen. At this point in her life, Junko had begged just to be killed, to no avail. She's endured about 40 days of hell on earth, and it's about to get worse. On January 3rd, 1989, the boys were in Minato's room, and one of them challenged Junko to a game of mahjong. Mahjong is a Japanese game similar to dominoes, if that helps for context. Junko finally had a stroke of luck and won the game. The boys became enraged and beat Junko. This wasn't the final beating, however. When the boys were finished beating Junko, they all left and went to one of the other boys' houses to go drink. Junko was left alone, in pain, barely clothed, and sobbing in Minato's room. On January 4th, 1989, Junko's wish would finally be granted. The boys, still enraged from losing to Junko the day before, decided to take their frustration out on her. Still at another boy's house, they all made their way over to Minato's house and began wailing on Junko's near-lifeless body. Fire was used a lot during this beating. Watanabe noticed Junko started bleeding and her infected wounds started spewing pus everywhere, so he wrapped a plastic bag around his hand to lower the chances of him being associated with any crimes. The other boys followed in suit. The boys stood her up and beat her until she bled from the mouth. One of the hits was too powerful for Junko to stand, and she crashed headfirst into a desk, which led to the second time she entered convulsions. The boys thought Junko was pretending to have a seizure and became more enraged and beat her harder. Reports suggest they beat her for up to 2 hours straight. The boys felt satisfied with their beating and left to go drink at another boy's house again. Junko laid in Minato's room trying to recover from another day of beatings and another seizure alone and in even worse pain than the night before. Fortunately for Junko, the pain would end here. At around 10, couldn't find if it was AM or PM, on January 4th, 1989, Junko Furuta would finally die after 44 days of torture. Junko died just 2 weeks before her 18th birthday. The next day, January 5th, 1989, Minato's brother called Minato in a panic stating, "Come quick, the girl is in a strange condition." The boys hurried back to Minato's house and found Junko's corpse. They finally had killed Junko Furuta after all they'd done. Fearing being caught by the police, Hiroshi Miyano, the ringleader, ordered the boys to wrap Junko's body in blankets and stuff the corpse in a travel bag. They also stuffed a tape of Tonbo, the show Junko was going to watch at home, in the bag with Junko's corpse. Later that night, Minato used some connections to get a cement truck. The boys stuffed Junko's body in a 55-gallon drum and filled it with concrete. The drum weighed approximately 305 kilograms or 672 pounds. The boys then dropped the drum containing Junko's body in a reclaimed landfill area of the Koto ward in Tokyo. The area where Junko's body was dropped is now known as Wakasu Park on Wakasu Island in Tokyo. Strange fact, the Olympic Committee wanted to use Wakasu Island as the area for the canoe slalom events in the Tokyo Olympics in 2020, but they later changed the location. Following the dumping of Junko's mutilated corpse, the crime went unheard of for almost 3 months. Nobody except the boys and Minato's family had seen or heard from Junko since she called her mother on November 27, 1988. This would change on March 29, 1989, as Miyano and Ogura were detained and questioned about their potential roles in 2 crimes between Adachi, where Minato lived, and Misato City, where Junko was originally kidnapped. Remember that 19-year-old woman the boys raped and let go? She reported them to the cops. The other crime regarded the murder of a mother and her 7-year-old son, which has sadly never been solved even to the date of recording. The murder of the mother and son happened just a couple of weeks before Junko was kidnapped. Miyano, who thought A. Ogura had confessed to murdering Junko, and B. authorities were questioning him about Junko's murder, confessed to Junko's murder in detail. Miyano also let authorities know exactly where to find Junko's body and the drum containing it. Authorities arrested Miyano and Ogura as soon as Miyano finished his story and sent an immediate warrant out for the arrest of Minato and Watanabe. Minato's brother was also arrested for being an accomplice. On March 30th, 1989, authorities found the drum containing Junko's body where the infamous photo was taken. Warning, this is an unsettling photo. After finally cracking the drum open and removing Junko's body from the drum, coroners were having trouble identifying the body. Because of the brutality Junko had been put through, combined with the accelerated decomposition of the body, identifying Junko at literal face value became impossible. Junko had to be identified by her fingerprints. The level of mutilation done to the lower parts of Junko's body, not just her face, was also evident as coroners found shattered glass where shattered glass should never be found. Autopsy reports revealed that Junko was pregnant at the time of her death, and they also revealed the DNA of 2 other men, Koichi Ihara and Tetsuo Nakamura, who were later arrested for the role in the unspeakable crimes committed against Junko. These 2 men were the only 2 men arrested besides the main 4 perpetrators, which means up to 94 other men were never convicted of raping Junko. Coroners also found the tape of Tonbo. Authorities asked Miyano why he packed that in the bag, and he said something along the lines of, "She wanted to watch the last episode. I didn't pack it in there out of pity. I don't want her spirit to haunt me." The unfortunate task of relaying the information of Junko's death to her family was carried out. Upon hearing what Junko endured during her captivity, her mother fainted. Reports also stated that after Junko's mother had regained consciousness, she had a total mental breakdown. The investigation of this case is the biggest miscarriage of justice I've ever seen. During the investigation, incarceration, and hearings for this case, the boys' names and faces remained out of the public eye. In Japan, people under the age of 20 are considered minors. All 4 boys, as well as Junko, were under the age of 20, making all of them minors under Japanese law. To be exact, Hiroshi Miyano was 18 at the time of the murder, Joe Ogura was 17, Nobuharu Minato was 16, and Yasushi Watanabe was 17. This legally protected their identities as they weren't considered adults. Unlike the boys, when news broke of Junko's murder, her name and face were made public on Japanese television, newspapers, and radios. Initially, the court handling the case labeled the perpetrators as A, B, C, and D. These letters correspond to the boys, so A was Miyano, B was Ogura, C was Minato, and D was Watanabe. A local journalist was rightfully upset by the reasoning and found a loophole and exposed the boys' true identities. He claimed the boys were inhuman for treating Junko like she wasn't human, torturing her for over 40 days. He also claimed the treatment of identities was unfair, that Junko was murdered and her name and face were made public, but the murderers' names and faces were kept secretive. This launched an uproar among the public and other journalists asking the court to confirm if the leaked names were true, and they were. Unfortunately, this is just the beginning of the unjust actions taken in this case. As hearings continued, a conclusion was made. All 4 boys were found guilty. Guilty of what, you may ask? Guilty of a charge created specifically during this case, specifically for this case. causing bodily injury resulting in death. This sentencing and charge was never used before this case, so the boys were given irregular sentences. Irregular sentences are shortened sentences that cannot be shorter than a certain amount of time, nor can they be longer than a certain amount of time. Furthermore, if the perpetrator of the crime has good behavior during their time in prison, they can get out early for good behavior. Based on the circumstances and extreme irregularity of the charge, all 4 perpetrators got a slap on the wrist sentence as follows. Hiroshi Miyano was identified as the leader and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Joe Ogura got 9 to 13 years. Nobuharu Minato got 5 to 7 years, the shortest sentence, and Yasushi Watanabe got 6 to 9 years. These are some pretty light sentences if you ask me. I did some calculations as if these awful crimes were committed in the US, and here is my results on screen. I did these calculations as if the boys were charged as adults and if this happened in the US, and I did them carried out to the greatest extent of the law. After the boys were sent to prison, Junko's funeral was held. All sorts of people showed up to pay their respects. Junko's family, close friends, former co-workers, classmates, and even her principal showed up to pay his respects to her. Sadly, her boyfriend never showed up to pay his respects, saying he couldn't look at Junko after what happened to her. So he went to the location where her body was found and paid his respects to his deceased girlfriend. He left flowers and wished her the best on the other side. Back at Junko's funeral, one of her close friends gave a heartbreaking speech. I'll play it now. こんな形で再会するとは夢にも思っていませんでした。痛かったでしょうね。苦しかったでしょうね。何も知らずに生活した自分に腹が立っています。いつもおおらかで明るい純ちゃん。文化祭の時みんなでお揃いで作った赤いハッピーとっても似合っていましたね。一生忘れないでしょう。私たちは純ちゃんの死を決して無駄にしません。恐ろしい犯罪がなくなって平和な日々が過ごせますように社会人1年生の私たちも努力します。また何か辛いことがあってもくじけずに精一杯生きようとした純ちゃんを思い出して頑張ります。校長先生が特別に卒業証書を書いてくださったそうですね。これで3年8組47名先生卒業できました。辛いことも苦しいこともありません。安らかに眠ってください。さようなら純ちゃん。While most people offered flowers, chocolates, some sort of grievance to Junko, her principal gave her the thing she looked forward to most, her high school diploma. In a disgusting act of selfishness following the conviction of Joe Ogura, his mother vandalized Junko's grave, claiming she ruined her son's life. This is wrong on so many levels. After this vandalization, Junko's grave was moved to a new, undisclosed cemetery. Sadly, the story isn't entirely over. It'll be 36 years in January since Junko's murder, which means the longest sentence handed out to Miyano has been served for over 20 years. That's right, all 4 men are free as of today. I'll explain what happened after each person was released and where they are or where they're rumored to be today. Hiroshi Miyano was released in 2004 after serving 15 years of his 20-year sentence. Following this, he changed his name and adopted a child. Reports suggest he changed his name to Hiroshi Yokoyama. Miyano became a banker and decided to raise his child. In January of 2013, however, Miyano was arrested for the conspiracy of fraud and his child was placed in a foster care facility. Miyano pleaded not guilty but still faced some jail time. He's been out of the spotlight with the law since his second release. Joe Ogura was released in 2001 and lived a relatively normal life after his release. He had a girlfriend for some time after his release as well. Ogura was again arrested in 2004 when he got mad at one of his coworkers, claiming his coworker slept with his girlfriend. Ogura assaulted the coworker, threw him in the back of his truck, and drove him to some train tracks. There, he repeatedly threatened to kill his coworker, later letting him go. Upon his arrest for assaulting and kidnapping this coworker, he disgustingly gloated about being one of Junko's murderers, saying it was, quote, the best thing that ever happened to him. Ogura has since been released and changed his name to Joe Kamisaku. Nobuharu Minato had the lightest sentence, being released sometime in the early 1990s. He changed his name to Shinji Minato, and this is a photo, the photo you've been seeing has been taken within the last 15 years or so. Minato has had multiple run-ins with the law since his initial release. He was arrested on assault charges in the early 2000s, and as recently as 2019, he was arrested for attempted murder and sentenced to 7 years in prison. He never served any time in the slammer for the attempted murder charge and has since been out of the limelight with the law. Yasushi Watanabe was released in 1996 and is the only one of the four not to be arrested again since his release. Watanabe was interviewed on April 8, 2001 as part of an article with the Shimbun Mainichi, or Daily Shimbun in English. The interview has unfortunately been lost with no records online. Reports suggest the interview and article showed Watanabe showing some remorse for what he did between November 1988 and January 1989, with others suggesting the article and interview showed too much sympathy toward the perpetrator. After the interview, Watanabe became a hikikomori, or someone who's experienced severe social separation. Watanabe may have changed his name, but no reports have been made with such information. Watanabe has virtually disappeared from all media, attention, everything. No one knows the current, if changed, name of Watanabe or his whereabouts. Let's talk about Junko's boyfriend at the time, Kawamura. Kawamura is a pseudonym, his real name isn't known. He was a 23-year-old construction worker who had been dating Junko since February of 1988. The two started dating shortly after Valentine's Day when Junko gave him some chocolates. Reports suggest the two were happy together and they'd been planning a skiing trip while Junko was on winter break. She knit him a sweater shortly before she was abducted. Sadly, the plan for the skiing trip fell through because of the horrible things that happened to her. In 2004, an independent filmmaker in Japan made a feature-length film titled Concrete. This film follows the true story and events that took place during this case. It has mixed reviews online. Finally, let's see what Shinji Minato has been up to on X. There's the post. It's written in Japanese. I clicked on the translation before taking this screenshot, and it was pretty much him trying to defend himself for what he did back in the 80s, and it's a really ridiculous post. And all the comments are pictures of Junko, the description on Wikipedia, for that everything about this case, from people even saying you'll rot in hell. It's a crazy comment section, but it's really not a good thing that he posted that. It's actually insane that he's trying to defend himself on social media.